Hello everybody, welcome to the panel discussion that we're doing jointly with EASE and UKRIO. We're doing this especially for Peer Review Week 2022. So a big warm welcome to everybody. We've got quite a number of you joining this afternoon, so please, as you join, wherever you're joining from, whether it be morning or afternoon or evening, pop yourselves a little note in the chat to say who you are and where you're calling from, and then we get a bit of a view of how many people we've got from around the world. So our discussion today is going to be on how can peer review support research integrity. That's our panel discussion, and in front of you you can see our panel of expert speakers who are going to give their insights into this subject as we go. So I can see we've got about 50 people in the webinar already, which is great to see everybody. So please just pop your name in the chat and tell us where you're calling from, where you're joining us from, and we'll be able to have a bit of a chat between everybody before we get started. So just a few housekeeping rules. We're operating in a webinar, so you'll be able to see the panelists in front of you now with their video screens up. If you would keep your screens and your microphones and your videos off for the webinar. And then if you have any questions, if you pop them into the Q&A, we'll pick those up at the end of the session after the first part of the discussion. If you would like to answer your questions live, then just pop that in your question to say so, and we can enable your mic and so on so that you can answer live. So I will put all of that sort of detail in the chat, but we've got 65 odd people in, so we'll get underway in just a moment. I'll just leave a few more minutes for people to do there. Right, let me see if I can fix the problem. So I'm getting a few bits on my chat to say that there's a problem with the chat being disabled for attendees. So let me see if I can fix that a minute. James, or Matt, can I hand over to one of you just to keep going for a sec?
Certainly. My name is James Parry. I'm Chief Executive of the UK Research Integrity Office, and we're very glad to be doing this joint webinar with the European Association of Science Editors, EASE, for Peer Review Week. Today's format is you'll get an introduction to research integrity from me, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Matt of UKRIO, who will chair the much more interesting part of the session, which is the panel discussion on peer review. John, Gowri, and Magda and Carlisle will all be giving really great insights into what peer review means for the research community, why it matters, its strengths and weaknesses, different approaches to peer review. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind that peer review is a communal activity. I often think of peer review as something that's done to us when we submit our research, when we put our heads above the parapet and decide to disseminate our outputs, our conclusions, our findings. Then these mysterious cabals of peer reviewers have a look at our work, and then they decide whether it passes muster or not. But actually, peer review is done by the research community. It's unpaid labour. Sometimes it's anonymous, sometimes it's identifiable. But we as researchers, we make up those peer review panels. So knowledge of peer review, how to do it as well as how to have it done to you, if you like, is really important. And the very concept of peer review and all its myriad forms, because lots of different ways of doing it, is really important for the honesty, accuracy, reliability of research, and therefore for public trust in research, for research integrity. Okay, so the chat now seems to be a bit more live. I don't know if it's been unlocked for attendees or not. My apologies. I know that Mary is looking at the settings and trying to get that working. I would suggest in the interim, if you have any comments you want to make, we know the Q&A function is working for attendees. So please put your comments out. Someone just said hello from sunny Croatia. So that, I think, suggests the chat function is now working. Mary, thank you for sorting that out. And I'd like to thank our attendees for all their patience. Okay, given the time, and as Mary's done a housekeeping announcement, Matt, I suggest we move on to my quick talk and then start panel discussions. Does that sound all right? Okay, I'll just quickly share my slides. Okay, brilliant. So, as I said earlier, well, a few moments ago, not so much earlier, I'm James Parry. I'm Chief Executive of the UK Research Integrity Office, which is a charity and independent advisory body on anything to do with good research practice. how to get it right, what to do if things go wrong, and we support individuals, researchers and organisations throughout the UK covering all subject areas of research. And we're very pleased to be doing this joint webinar for Peer Review Week with EASE. So what is research integrity? I mean, there are a few ways you can view it, but in many ways it can be viewed as synonymous with good research practice on a variety of levels. It's about ensuring that your research is of high quality and high ethical standards. It's about doing the best research that you can. It's about you as a researcher reflecting on the challenges that you face and pressures that you face in trying to do good research and how to overcome them. And it also goes beyond the level of individual researchers or even individual research teams and individual research projects. It's about the research community thinking about the challenges and pressures facing all researchers and what we can collectively do to overcome them. Whether the way we fund, carry out, assess and disseminate research improves or harms quality and ethical standards, often described as issues of research culture or so-called publish or perish. And this isn't me being aspirational or speaking in a vacuum. These are topics being considered by governments, by research funds, by publishers, by major research organisations. And there's a huge amount of discussion within the academic press, within academic journals, and throughout the research community. This is very much a topic that's on everybody's minds. And that's, I think, because of a background of growing questions about the overall reliability of research, growing interest in whether researchers are getting things right or wrong and why, and going back to the issue of systemic pressures, the so-called publish or perish. And it's worth noting that all the challenges faced by researchers have increased in recent years because the pandemic has put pressure on all sections of society, and the research community isn't immune to that. The UK has, taking one country on its own, has a justified reputation for producing high quality research, ethical research, and having a high caliber of researchers. But no country is immune to mistakes, to sloppiness, and to research fraud. Without trust, we can't do research, and to have trust, we in our research must have integrity. That's why it's important, and that's why it applies to everyone involved in research, or we will have a role to play on this. Good research integrity basically means good practice, meeting basic standards for research, regardless of the source, whether they're disciplinary standards, regulatory or contractual standards, stuff your supervisor or team leader says, guidelines, institutional conventions, ethical approval conditions, adopting best practice on research methods, on managing your data, on consent and other key issues, on dissemination and authorship. And this is something that applies to all disciplines. The specific will vary according to discipline or subdiscipline, but the overall kind of ethos and themes remain the same. It applies to all career stages, from the moment you start out into a research career to the moment you retire and get to put your feet up for the first time in 40 years. And it applies from the moment you come up with the idea or theory for your research to the moment you disseminate it, archive it, and move on to something else. And this is something to be done kind of actively and continuously throughout the life cycle of your research project. It's not just me think about it at the beginning, when you can maybe perhaps consider, do I need ethical approval, or this is something that is through the life cycle of your research project. The good news is you're probably doing an awful lot of this already. This is part of the everyday professional good practice of being a researcher. It isn't something other, something alien. This is, working out what good research practice means for you, thinking about it perhaps a bit more than you currently do. And that's perhaps the key message, if you like, from this talk that I'm doing. This is stuff you need to think about a bit more than you currently do, a bit. You're not expected to treat yourself as a researcher as, a set of errors waiting to happen, or a potential research criminal, or to straitjacket yourself. This is not what this is about. This is about reminding yourself that integrity, good practice, ethics, basic standards, call it what you will, applies to you and your research, regardless of your discipline, regardless of whether you have external funding or not, regardless of whether you have human participants or not, regardless of whether you needed ethical approval or not. It's about working out what good research practice means for you and your discipline and your particular research project in your particular research environment, and remembering that the rules of the road for research, if you like, aren't set by researchers themselves, they're set by others, and they change and evolve. And there can be a fine line between acceptable practice and unacceptable practice, between the correct research method, for example, and something that's not right for the situation or has been discredited. So we need as a community to be quite self-reflective in our practice, and otherwise problems can occur. I should note you'll be getting a copy of all the slides, and this is being recorded, so if you're taking notes, my apologies, I should have said that, you don't really need to. UKRIO has been running an advisory service since its inception in 2006, and we help individuals and organisations get things right and help them when things go wrong. An recurring theme we've seen in Challenges to Good Research Practice is that people can kind of fall in love with a theory or an idea. This is brilliant, all we need to do is prove it, or this will be so good once we've done the study and written it up. And that can be the start of a very slippery slope. Serious problems can sometimes occur because of overconfidence or difficulties in individuals speaking out and saying what they're grappling with. And we think it's really important that to avoid mistakes and to improve quality and standards and ethical practice, we should really collectively be self-critical, if you like, reflective about what we're doing about in terms of our research and what's the best way to do things. And this isn't a burden that should be put on researchers alone. Organisations need to really help in inculcating cultures of research, where environments where people can talk openly about the successes and challenges that they're facing, and where there's no stigma attached in asking for help. I think as researchers, we're a profession that discovers stuff or finds out stuff or invents stuff. I think with that can often come a pressure that, well, we should know what we're doing. We should be able to figure out the answer to any solution. Pardon me. And actually, just like every profession in the world, we're not immune to mistakes. We're not immune to moments of self-doubt. We're not immune to pressures and negative incentives within the organisations and systems that we work. So it's really important for individuals and organisations to recognise it's okay to not know what to do. It's okay to ask for help, and organisations must be supportive. And a lot of this is about culture and leadership and improving systems and incentives. And some of this will come from the top downwards. Others is more a case of collective action, and that kind of working together, and that's really important. Which then leads me on to, you will please hear the last slide, which is peer review. Now, this is a definition from the Committee on Publication Ethics, who are utterly brilliant in terms of publication ethics, as you get from the name, authorship, peer review, and the like. They're a fantastic resource for journals and editors. But if you are someone who submits to a journal, I think you'll find an awful lot of stuff of interest on their website as well, publicationethics.org. It's framed often as a resource for journals and publishers and editors, but there's lots of useful nuggets and some very overt guidance for researchers as well. So going back to what I said kind of in the introductory bit, peer review is a collective activity by the research community. It's one of the kind of checks and balances for research dissemination. It has various types of peer review, have the strengths and the weaknesses, and peer review as a concept has been subject to an awful lot of debate over years of how it can be made better. And I think we'll always be looking for that perfect solution. But it's, I think, also important to recognise that every one of us has a role to play in this, in carrying out peer review and in improving it and enhancing it and learning from the process, whether we are having our submissions reviewed by others or whether we're acting as reviewers, because this is a collective activity by the research community to help safeguard and enhance good research practice. So thank you very much, and after that introduction, I'll now hand over to my colleague Matt, who will take you through the rest of the session.
Thanks, James. So I'm Matt Hodgkinson. I'm a Research Integrity Manager at UKRIO, and I am Treasurer of EASE as well. And so I thought we'd join forces for this Peer Review Week webinar. So I was also previously, until the start of this year, I worked at various open access publishers. So I've got a background in peer review, editorial and research integrity. And I'm also on Cope Council as well. And Caroline's on with COPE as a trustee as well. So I'm going to chair this session, so hopefully not talk too much, and I'm just going to introduce the 4 great speakers we've got on the panel today. So they're each going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to have a panel discussion afterwards. So if you have any questions that you want the panel to answer, then please put it in the Q&A tab rather than in the chat, and then we'll be able to prioritize the questions. I've got plenty lined up already myself. So we're going to start with Dr. Gowri Gopalakrishna from the Amsterdam University Medical Centre. And then we're going to have John Carlisle, who is at the Torquay Hospital in the UK. We are going to have Caroline Porter of SAGE and COPE trustee. And then we're going to end with Magdalena Morawska at UCL. So Gowri, you're up first.
Okay.
Let's see your slides.
You can hear me. I'm not on mute, so I'm going to share my screen. And if that's okay, just for the transmission, I sometimes have issues with screen sharing and my video being turned on. I'll just turn my video off briefly for the 5 minutes and have that turned right back on when I'm done. You should be able to see my slides now. Right. So I have 5 minutes to give a short take on the topic at hand, which, as you just heard James introducing, looking at research integrity and its role in peer review. So I will jump right in. I will say I'm based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. So I'm slightly jealous that there are attendees attending from sunny Barcelona and Croatia. It's not sunny at all over here on this end of the globe. But my first slide is really actually to, I wanted to start by reminding us of Robert Merton's proposition of scientific norms, or sometimes affectionately known as kudos. He proposed in 1940s the following 4 norms, which you see on my slide. Suffice to say, they have been debated and contested since then. But I do feel, as a research integrity meta-researcher and open science researcher, that these 4 norms fit very succinctly with what we are attempting to achieve in research integrity and in also peer review. Now, the 4 norms really essentially talk about communality, that science is a product of social collaboration assigned to the community, universalism, which speaks to the acceptance or rejection of claims, needing to be independent of any personal or social attributes of the disinterestedness, where researchers should be motivated by identifying the truth rather than other motivations, which may be selfish in nature or not. That is to be debated. And organized skepticism, my personal favorite, and probably the one that's most relevant to the topic today, which is the ability to verify data and scrutinize others' claims, being critical for the credibility and progress of research. Now, in the last 4 years, I have been busy leading a study looking at the prevalence of 3 different types of research behaviors, as well as some associative factors that might help us understand what drives these behaviors. This was the Dutch National Survey on Research Integrity. We had roughly about 7,000 respondents. And what we found, which you essentially see here, the main results, is that QRPs, questionable research practices, and research misconduct, are also known as fabrication and falsification, happen still too frequently. 1 in 2 researchers self-reported having frequently committed at least 1 questionable research practice. And when it came to falsification or fabrication of data, or both, this was about 1 in 12 researchers. Now, given that these estimates are self-reported estimates, we do tend to believe that the true estimates are likely to be higher, placing even greater importance on the need for better research quality. What we did do in this study is also to take a step further in trying to understand which associative factors might be driving these behaviors of questionable practice and research misconduct. And interestingly, what you see on this slide are two factors that I want to highlight amongst the others that we found. And what we saw was that subscription to these Mertonian or scientific norms, as I just introduced them earlier, are still very much alive among the 7,000 or so researchers that we surveyed. There was a significant association between subscribing to these norms and a lowered likelihood of engaging in questionable research practices and research misconduct, suggesting that the revival of these norms in our community and research cultures may be important. Additionally, the other factor which had the biggest effect size in lowering the likelihood of research misconduct was the perceived likelihood of detection of such behaviors by reviewers. In other words, this seems to tell us that researchers still believe quite strongly in the strength of peer review as an important means to safeguarding research quality. But peer review, as we know it, tends to get a bad rap. And I would like to make a suggestion that perhaps this is because it's not set up in the best possible way to support research as a collaborative effort, research as needing to be open and transparent in order to ensure accountability and trust, especially as we move towards open science and the uptake of open science practices, and research as a scientific dialogue of sorts, and at best a proposition of the truth. So we are back to the proverbial carrot or stick story. If we indeed see and value peer review as a means to safeguarding research integrity, then why aren't we recognizing and rewarding that behavior accordingly? So to this end, a few suggestions on my last slide. Firstly, I think that it is important to recognize and reward peer review, be that extrinsically through promotions and tenure tracks, or intrinsically through rewards within a research group or department, highlighting and praising good reviewers and reviews. Secondly, I also think that it's important that the review of research should be happening, and I think we all agree on this, as James also pointed out, that it should ideally be happening at all stages of research and not only at its end. And although this is changing, it's happening quite slowly. It should become a norm rather than an exception, which in a way also goes back to my earlier point on rewarding and recognizing the behavior that we want to see in research and in our research community. Thirdly, well, let's face it, peer review is about critique. That is something that we are all very well aware of. And that's hard even for the best of us, especially to receive. So I do believe that training of researchers in peer review, in good peer review and good peer review practices should be part of the education on how to peer review and what standards to go by. And perhaps this could even be a journal commitment to collective standards, similar in a way to reporting standards. Now, while journals may already do this, from my personal experience as a peer reviewer and as editor, know that the quality tends to vary greatly. And a final note here is to make a push for going broader in our definition of peer review, especially with the advent of open science. Here, I'd like to particularly emphasize civil society, that science or scientific education is equally necessary and important in being able to assess the credibility of research, whether it is in a journal or a preprint or a study protocol that is shared through open science practices. We need to be able to address the need for scientific education on a broader educational agenda. So that's my 5-minute take on peer review. I'll hand it over back to you, Matt. Sharing.
Thank you, Gowri. That was excellent. Yeah, I love the idea that researchers have to commit to addressing criticism. So next up we have John Carlisle, who is an anaesthetic consultant with the NHS and is also otherwise known as a data sleuth on clinical trials. So hand over to you, John.
Thanks, Matt. I don't have any slides. You're welcome to contact me if you wish. I'm an editor for a journal called Anaesthesia. And before that, I was an editor for the Cochrane collaboration. During my work for both, I've come across falsified data. The first was by an anaesthetist called Yoshi Takafuji, who has approximately 183 randomized controlled trials retracted. You can look on the Retraction Watch leaderboard database to see how many papers have been retracted for various authors, and he's currently #1 on that list. The rest of the list have got quite a few other anaesthetists, so either we as a clinical specialty lie a lot, or we're just not very good at it and we keep on getting found out. The take-home messages from me, and I'll be interested in where we go with the discussion. The take-home messages are about 1/3 of randomized controlled trials submitted to my journal have sufficiently falsified data that they shouldn't be published. So about 1 in 3 papers. I then followed up those papers and most have been published. So I'd guess that if our experience at Anaesthesia is replicated across all journals, then maybe about 1 in 3 randomized controlled trials that you read are fabricated, possibly more. And one might imagine that that would apply to other types of papers as well. So I think the extent of the problem is huge. From an ethical point of view, the focus for me is the patient, who's the ultimate consumer of good or bad clinical practice, which often is based upon research. And obviously, if the research is faulty, so is the practice, potentially imperiling the lives and health of the patients that I help care for. The opportunity as a peer reviewer to identify fabricated data is limited. If you just look at the paper as supplied to you as a peer reviewer, you'll identify probably about 2 out of 100 papers you review as having falsified data. If you have access to individual patient data, so large spreadsheets of numbers, you've got a much richer data source from which to identify falsified data, and that will increase your ability to identify falsified data about 20-fold. So taking your identification of false trials from somewhere between 1 and 2 in 100 up to around 30 or so in 100. Elizabeth Bix may be a name you're familiar with. She identifies falsified data, or at least copied data, in the form of Western blots, histology slides, other data-rich environments. The problem with the papers that you'll generally review is that they have insufficient density of data for you to identify falsehood. So my recommendation is that you might start requesting individual patient data from the authors of papers you're peer reviewing or editing for. It's a big job, it takes a lot of time, and I'm more than happy to help other people look for falsified data, but I have limited time myself as a full-time clinician. But I'll try and help if I can. I'll certainly have some tips of how you might go about looking at spreadsheets, and a couple of appendices in the papers I've published have examples of spreadsheet data in which I've identified falsified data. So I've spoken probably for long enough because I think my contribution will be largely led by questions from the attendees. So I look forward to hearing questions you've got and maybe thoughts you've got about this particular problem. I'll hand back over to Matt, if I may.
Thanks, John. I'm going to bounce it straight back to you because we have a question from Ksenia in the Q&A that I think would probably be best just taken by you directly, because it's not a general one. So is there any progression in the case of non-random sampling in the over 5,000 RCTs in anaesthesia and general medical journals you've discovered?
So by progression, I assume that the, so I forgot your name, let me have a look. Ksenia. I assume you mean have any further trials been retracted? So the main headline trial that was retracted after I analysed those trials was a study in the New England Journal called the Predimed trial, which was about Mediterranean diet. The New England Journal took that particular paper quite seriously, and they looked quite closely at 11 sort of the least likely data distributions of the couple of hundred papers I analysed from that journal. Of the others, most had false data, but it could be corrected. So they had a few corrections as well. The other journals, JAMA, and for anaesthetic journals, I don't think have looked systematically at the papers that I highlighted. So no, I'm not aware of any particular progression on those. But as I said, looking at summary data, which was the analyses in that particular paper I published, that was for summary data, and it's a very blunt tool for identifying false data. So it'll only pick up a few. And some of those that I picked up, I didn't say they had false data, I just said they're unlikely distributions. False data, as I said, you need a richer data set, which involved the Predimed authors looking back at their study and how it was conducted and realizing they'd made an error. So the unlikely distributions doesn't mean people have made stuff up, although it's a possible cause of false data, but it does make error or intentional falsehood fairly likely. So no, I think the answer to your question is no, I'm not aware of any additional progression.
Great, thank you, John. So next up we have Caroline Porter. Caroline is a publisher with Sage and is also a trustee of the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE. Caroline, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. I will share my slides now. Hopefully everyone can see those. Okay. So first of all, happy peer review week, and thank you to UKRIO and EASE for inviting me along today. I'm coming to this conversation with two hats, as Matt indicated, one as Associate Vice President for Research Publishing at Sage, and one as a trustee of COPE. And as such, I'm really thinking about peer review and research integrity from the lens of publication ethics. And as I see it, the primary aim of peer review in this context is about building a credible body of knowledge, and that the purpose of peer review in that context is to advance scholarship. And as others have said, it's an incredibly important system of checks and balances. It is, of course, an ecosystem. Publishers, journal editors, researchers, peer reviewers, funders, academic institutions, and industry groups all have a part to play in making sure that this system works. So I wanted to share this quote from Professor Karen Wolf. To my mind, peer review is an imperfect system, and it is subject to bias, misjudgment, and human error. However, it is a vital part of quality control, and the system of scholarly knowledge production would be weaker without it. And this is a piece that Karen Wolf co-authored, which was published in Scholarly Kitchen earlier this week. And I think I'll give you 30 seconds to read the quote because I think she puts it very well. So I think the key thing here is that peer review is never meant to be definitive about whether the research and the interpretation of the research sources is right or wrong per se. It simply indicates that a group of experts have deemed it valuable enough to fund or publish or earn a position for the researcher. In this excerpt, Karen Wolf also alludes to dimensions of bias that can play out in peer review. And I think that all the stakeholders need to be mindful of and seek to address that bias in order to create a more equitable platform for scholarly communication. COPE's peer review guidelines provide basic principles and standards to which all reviewers should adhere during the peer review process in research publication. And I've highlighted a couple of key points here from that guidance, both emphasising the importance of the role, but also the extent to which it relies on trust, on personal and professional integrity, and on goodwill. And peer reviewers really play a central and critical part in the production of scholarly knowledge, but too often they come to the role without enough guidance or enough support around their obligations. Reviewers also have other demands on their time, meaning they may not have the capacity to be as thorough as one might like them to be in an ideal world where we all have enough time for everything. As I was talking about earlier, research integrity is really a shared endeavour across multiple stakeholders. Publishers exist within an ecosystem, and there needs to be collaboration and coordination across all parts of that system towards the common goal of credible knowledge production. I think we should also talk about why misconduct or mistakes happen in the first place, and it's been alluded to by James in his introduction around the publish or perish culture and the question of how we can incentivize good behavior and research. It's not just publishers, it's not just institutions, it's each part of this ecosystem working together in partnership, being willing to share knowledge and experience, admit their mistakes, and work to improve. And for me as a publisher, it's worth saying that we sit towards the end of the research cycle. So our role in supporting research integrity will often mean that we act as gatekeepers rather than participating in prevention. We can help set standards, provide processes, provide training and support, but funders and institutions are better placed to drive incentive, motivation, and overall research integrity from the outset. Finally, I just wanted to point towards a few resources that you might find useful. SAGE offers a free webinar on how to be a peer reviewer. The next one is running on November the 9th. COPE also provides a wealth of materials, free resources and guidance, including ethical guidelines for peer reviewers. There's the STM Integrity Hub, which SAGE and other publishers are involved in, and this is an important cross-publisher initiative. It's a new initiative, and I think it's a great opportunity for publishers to work together to address, detect, and prevent various types of fraud and misconduct. And finally, SOPs for RI, or Standard Operating Procedures for Research Integrity. This is an organisation that has built what they're calling a toolbox, which is a set of easy-to-use standard operating procedures and guidelines for research performing and research funding organisations. So I hope that's useful, and I will hand back to Matt, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, it's always worth remembering that peer review is just one part of the research integrity ecosystem, and thinking of how it all links together is really important. And so then finally, we are going to have Magdalena Morawska, who's now with UCL's research integrity team, and previously worked at BMC and Springer Nature. Over to you, Magda.
Hi, thank you. Unfortunately, I cannot start my video back. So if Mary could start my video, that's great. Thank you. So welcome everyone again. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to share my presentation with you, and hopefully my thoughts about peer review. So it is really interesting to see that this is focusing on research integrity and how peer review can support it. And I hope I can also show that it's a little bit of a two-way street. And to start this, I need to take a step back and think again about what research integrity is. And James did a great job introducing research integrity. And I think we need to, again, try to ask the questions, why is integrity important? So what's the purpose of research integrity? And the actual purpose is to deliver high quality research that can be trusted. And if you think about peer review, right, while there is much criticism of it, I think most people still agree that that's still really useful to help evaluate the research and sort of establish the quality of it. And thinking about the purpose, actually the purpose of peer review is also to deliver high quality research that can be trusted. So here, research integrity and peer review, have the same purpose. And I do think it's a two-way street. I think peer review supports research integrity, but research integrity can support peer review too. And there are many different definitions of research integrity, but I think what's useful is to think about it in terms of core elements or principles, or some call them values. And here in the UK, we have the UK Concordat to support research integrity that outlines those principles. But other areas, so in the Europe, you have the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, which outlines similar principles, which generally include honesty, rigor, care and respect, accountability, transparency, and open communications. And these apply to all stages of research, right? To all stages of research life cycle. And I think this can be useful in peer review too. And I think most of researchers, if not all, really find at some point or another on the receiving end of the comments. And it's not easy to deal with criticism, right? We all been there. It's really hard. But how could the principles of integrity help us do it with integrity? And again, this is just an interpretation of those principles and how it could be used, and it will depend on the personal interpretation of those values. But for example, if you think about honesty, right? So look at the comments honestly. Is there a point worth considering that you might have missed or an error you made? Particularly rigor, right? Check and recheck your data, make sure you really answer all the comments. Open and transparent communication is always really important. Whether you disagree with comments of the editor or the reviewer, you can raise this, but keeping in mind the care and respect for their work and the time they've put in. So I think we need to always maybe sometimes remind ourselves about the language we use in such communications and make sure it's respectful. And accountability is particularly important for integrity, right? As a researcher producing research, producing those outputs, you want to publish the best quality research. And peer review is opportunity for you to be better, to learn and make your research better. Now, if we flip to this, so how those principles could apply to being a peer reviewer, I think it's, again, quite similar. Okay, let's think about honesty. Obviously, you need to look at the both positive and negative parts of the work, but there's that personal element of the honesty and knowing your own knowledge and its limitations and asking yourself, are you actually the right person to judge the whole work and all of its aspects? And again, rigor, that's obvious, pay attention to details. But then we come to the open and transparent communication. Say, communication is a two-way street. You can be honest about your opinions, but if you feel there's some problems with the work, you can raise them, right? And you should raise them. But also you should be, again, this kind of link to the honesty be honest about your personal potential conflict of interest. And again, communicate with editors so they are clear on what's happening there. And again, going back to that care and respect for all of people involved in this, is whether authors, editors, or reviewers, let's make sure we use appropriate, respectful language when you do it. And when being peer reviewer, I think there is actually quite a big accountability, the personal responsibility involved in doing peer reviews, is because when you're doing it, you are contributing to the general knowledge and a stronger research community. And I feel that's a really big responsibility. So to finish up my 5 minutes, I think peer review is extremely important in evaluating and producing higher quality research. And it can support integrity, but research integrity can support peer review. And together they make the research and researchers and research community stronger. So thank you.
That's great, Magdalena. I like the turning of the question on its head. So we are now going to proceed to have how long? 45 minutes of about 40 minutes of Q&A. So we are, oh, my video, there we go. So we are going to try to stick to the angle of how peer review can help ensure the integrity of research rather than the integrity of peer review, but we'll probably stray into publication ethics as well. So let's not worry too much, but we'll try and keep ourselves on theme anyway. So I'm going to start with a question which John has touched on already, but it's, can we expect peer review to detect misconduct? I'm going to ask Caroline to go first on that one.
Thank you. I would answer that by saying that, as I alluded to as well, that peer review isn't ever going to be a perfect system. The aim with peer review is to sort of check the validity of the research. It's important to guide reviewers on what the expectations are around their input. And it's not necessarily going to, whilst it's designed to pick up errors, mistakes, provide guidance, recommendations and suggestions to the author, it isn't really designed to detect deliberate misconduct, for example, falsification and fabrication of data. It's going to, some of those are very, very difficult to detect, and peer reviewers are not necessarily always going to have the tools and the expertise to pick those up. So I think it's a really, really essential part of the process, and it strengthens the validity and the credibility of research, but it's not reasonable to rest the burden of that detection solely on the shoulders of peer reviewers, although they're certainly important to the process.
Great. Who wants to jump in? You can all turn your mics on, by the way.
I'm happy to jump in because I think it's a really important aspect of it. Like, should peer review be able to detect it? And again, coming from research integrity perspective for it, what's research? Why is research important? Why do we do it? And for me, it's all based on trust, right? Researchers need to trust each other to do research because they usually build upon previous work. And I think similarly, peer reviewers need to approach the papers from the trust point of view, because if we don't trust anything we see, if we question everything, how can we move forward? How can you, and I say, I absolutely respect when John's going through data. I think that's an amazing and enormous amount of work. But the reality is not everyone is able to do that. And even John said, this is a massive kind of time commitment. But I think second part of it, so I think on one hand, I think there's trust. So I wouldn't expect peer reviewers to do, because I would expect them to trust in the research they're reviewing. But I think linked to this sort of slightly separate issue is the training. And we've all discussed that actually lots of peer reviewers actually don't get any formal training in being a peer reviewer. But now you're expecting to add another layer of checks, which actually is publication ethics issues or misconduct issues or whatever you want to call them. Have they had training in those to know even what those are? So if you don't know what those are, how can you recognize them? So I feel like it's a bit unrealistic to expect for peer review to detect misconduct.
Can I sort of jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
And give my 2 cents. I think I do tend to agree with what Magda and Caroline have already said, that I think peer review as it's currently done is unlikely to detect misconduct. However, it was interesting that in our survey that researchers tend to actually believe that peer reviewers have the ability to detect misconduct. And the association that we found was that that belief, that perceived likelihood, did reduce then the tendency to then engage in research misconduct. So that's actually really quite interesting, that as a research community, I think we tend to value peer review as being able to then really spot fabricators and falsifiers, when in reality it actually is not able to, in the way that it is set up. However, I do want to also say, when we talk about peer review, are we talking about journal peer review? I imagine that we are, in this context, that we are talking about journal peer review. And COVID-19 has shown us something slightly different. I think what's happened in COVID-19 is that we have seen, the social media community of researchers or otherwise calling out has been falsified and fabricated, and there are some amazing examples there. There have also been, heated discussions on how different research has been conducted. So I do think that, we need to also define the peer review in which context. I think in the journal context, I don't think that it is currently set up in a way to allow detection of research misconduct, but I do think in open science, where we are sharing preprints, we are also sharing study protocols, and we are, sharing data sets, that there is probably a better tendency to be able to detect research misconduct, not necessarily by journal peer reviewers, but by the larger scientific community.
Thanks, Gowri. I really think it's an interesting point you raised there about how there's the unintended consequence if we are honest about the limitations of peer review in catching misconduct, then it might incentivize people to commit more misconduct. Let's hope not. John, you want to go ahead?
Hi. Was the question should or can?
Haha. Answer how you wish.
All right. Well, obviously, peer review can detect fraud and fabrication, because I've done it and lots of other people have done it, and it's clear that often it doesn't, because then it's identified after publication. You don't get to hear about the identification before publication. It should do better than it does before publication, because some of the instances of data fabrication are really quite dumb. So those are the people we tend to spot. So the people who are not very good at telling lies, or tell fairly facile lies, and you can spot unnatural, almost impossible distributions on graphs and so on that are apparent as soon as somebody points them out to you. So I think peer review should do a better job of it than it does. It certainly can't identify all cases, and as I mentioned earlier in my preamble, only maybe about 1 out of 20 false papers were you identified just from the summary data papers. At least that's me. Other people might be able to spot a greater number, I don't know. So it should do better than it does, but no, it will only identify a small proportion unless we have access to much more data.
Yeah, and so I'll bring in Magdalena in a second. So we had a question from Ksenia in the chat, which speaks to that, which is about whether sharing raw data during submission would be effective, and whether peer reviewers could look at the data. So many journals are moving to have open data and data sharing statements, although these often don't require that the raw data is actually available during submission. Although I do know that PLOS, for example, has started asking for the raw Western blots, and some other publishers have gone down that route as well. So Magdalena, you can go as well and say what was on your mind, but we can also pivot to that point as well about whether we can have raw data shared during review, and whether the peer reviewers would look at it, and whether that would be fruitful.
Just one comment first, maybe finishing the thought from the previous one. I just wanted to kind of build a bit about from what Gowri said, because I think that's what's really important is, depending on how define peer review, I think peer review for particular purpose of journal review, when you have 1, 2, 3, 4 reviewers, might not be able, but the community review, the research community, I think is a much bigger sort of opportunity to spot it, and it does. And we know that post-publication review, whether official or not official happens, and it's actually really good at spotting those things. And I'm interested to see in the future how the fact we have more preprints and these are available much earlier on, and I will be interested to see whether those issues come up and are spotted because of how many eyes are looking at them earlier. So that was just to finish that thought, and I'm happy to pass over about the data, and happy later to comment about that too.
Who wants to jump in? Don't be shy.
Maybe I can actually just share some thoughts on. I think it's really good and also not just good, but really vital for journals to somehow be able to really move towards the model of asking for the raw data rather than it being a checkbox exercise, which it currently mostly is in most instances. You're asked, to declare, you declare, and I think it was a Nature piece which recently reported that, a staggering percentage, I think it was up to 90%, where data statements were filled up to 90%, but then it was less than 10% when authors actually did respond to the request of asking for data. And I just think that these numbers are very worrying, and we definitely need to try to see how can we move towards a model where the raw data is supplied at the point of submission. That's the first part of the story, but I think there's also, then the follow-up consequence of having submitted this raw data. Are the peer reviewers then going to be able to have the expertise to be able to look at this raw data and be able to make sense of it, and secondly, do they have time to be able to do that? So I think that I definitely would be the proponent of going for the raw data. I think that clearly, hands down, would help the integrity of peer review, or peer review supporting research integrity. But how will we deal with the consequences of supplying that data, having the right expertise and the time to be able to actually assess whether the analysis has been done in the way that it should be done? So I think there are a number of follow-up questions I don't have the answers to.
Yeah, and I think this this chimes with a question that Judith Shorten raised on the chat. Would it be helpful to have an expert or sleuth on the journal editorial panel to help check and verify studies? I think many publishers now have research integrity teams, such as I used to head, but we certainly didn't try and verify every single study. And certainly I've done similar checks to John on raw data, and actually it's extremely laborious. I've done like digit checking and final digit checking and attempting to use what's it called, Bentham's law and things like this. So and then I also wanted to add that then there was a study that was published just last week that showed that peer review increases the statistical content of articles. Articles that are desk rejected have less statistical content, and articles are rejected more when reviewers focus on statistics. So, and I'll just post that one in. So does this show us a glimmer of hope that peer review is working to help improve research integrity? Caroline, you were itching to talk.
I was. I mean, I think there are glimmers of hope, and actually I noticed Chris Graff posted a piece on Scholarly Kitchen earlier in the week about reasons to be cheerful. So I think that would be a good counterbalance to some of the concerns that we're exploring here. I was going to sort of, perhaps on a slight tangent, mention the concept of registered reports. And obviously this isn't specifically about data, it's about peer reviewing prior to data collection, and thereby kind of holding the researcher to account to their original thesis. So I think that is something that it's not necessarily applicable to every sort of field of research, but it's something that we certainly at Sage are interested in exploring and doing more of with our journals where it's relevant.
Who wants to jump in? Do we need specific expertise during peer review?
Yes. You probably want a bit more than that.
How do we get it?
Yeah, so I think it's very difficult for individual journals to do it. If you're going to employ somebody, it's quite an expensive thing to do. I think you probably need about sort of 0.4 of a person per journal, something like that. It depends on the journal, obviously. So maybe publishers, journal houses, whatever, could share that sort of expertise across more than one platform. You could have an independent organisation that's independent of journals, but it would need a whole big setup, and that would also be expensive. But yes, I think one does need expertise. Coming back to a comment earlier about trust, well, I guess my default is to distrust everybody. It's just how much do I distrust them? So I've got a sliding scale of distrust. So the authors I trust the least are those who've had retractions for falsified data or fabrication previously, who've got expressions of concern, notices on their papers, who submit from centres where we have identified falsified data previously. And unfortunately, also countries that don't have very rigorous research integrity structures that protect the researchers and the patients and so on. So I've got a sliding scale that combines various factors about the submitter. So if you were going to expend a lot of time, I'd tend to use that sort of sliding scale to work out who do we spend time looking at, and you might even use it to reject out of hand some submissions without even looking at the data.
Yeah, there's a real risk when we're talking about using factors to identify things. I think you can use it to flag things up, but I think the idea of kind of moving to some post-human AI world where we can just use predictive factors to reject articles, I think is what people are wary of. And I think as well, the principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing have just been updated and include what was a long-standing statement from COPE and some other organizations that we need to avoid the kind of geopolitics and that kind of background of the authors affecting editorial decisions. So it's a very tricky area. So there's a theme in some questions that we've got, which I think I'm going to lump together, which people have alluded to already, but it's essentially, so we're talking generally about how much peer review can help uphold research integrity. So this is the middle bit where it's been submitted to a journal and it's not published yet. So the questions are about the before and the after. So can institutions do more of pre-checking before articles are submitted? Can we do more checking at the preprint stage? And then can the community do a good job with the post-publication review stage, either just generally using a platform like PubPeer or particular platforms like F1000 Research? So it's a big one, but I think the themes kind of go together. So if anyone wants to take a bite at that one, then please go ahead.
I'm happy maybe to start the conversation, because I think this is a very important but a very difficult question, and it identifies actually a definite gap we have at the moment where peer review and responsibility for peer review actually falls slightly into the gaps, because on one hand, you have the researchers who are themselves employed at the institutions, either producing the research or reviewing the research, right? So you think, well, there's an obvious role for the institutions here. But then you have the publishers, right, that publish it, get money from it, and so on. So this is, and then you have those periods in between. So who has more responsibility for it? Who should be, training the peer reviewers? Who should be checking the data? And don't think there's an obvious answer one way or another. And I feel that the reason why we are here is because nobody really wants to take that responsibility, right? Because this is resources. And what sort of John's been saying over and over, this is big resources. Doing all of this, regardless who's doing it, is this massive undertaking, which would require, you know, hiring people, training people, and also they will be making mistakes, right? So who's responsible for their mistakes? And it's just because of such a big responsibility this is, nobody will, you know, say, yeah, we can do it, right? So I feel it's our responsibility together, and possibly together with funders, you know, to create a situation where this is possible. But I don't think it's a solution that one player or one stakeholder can take on their own.
I really agree with that. And I think we have to all play a part, and we all have to take the steps that we can. And as Matt alluded to already, publishers are building research integrity teams. We've got organisations such as COPE, EASE, UKRIO, SOPS for RI, who are all trying to kind of offer guidance, support, best practice. Universities and funders absolutely play a part as well. And I think it's where there are opportunities for us to work together and work collaboratively, we should take them. And I think this is why webinars, panels such as this are important, because it is an opportunity for us to cross-collaborate and share. Because you're right, no one person or no one institution, no one organisation has the sort of purview of the scholarly record. It's a kind of there isn't one organisation or stakeholder in this process that has the sort of ultimate that is the ultimate arbiter of what content is okay and what content is not okay. So we all have to play a part, and I think for organisations like COPE, they take that role very seriously, and I'm really pleased that the types of materials that COPE puts out, not just guidance and materials, it's also discussions, it's webinars, it's forums. So I feel that there's a wealth of resources for researchers and universities, in fact, not just publishers and journal editors, that are available that we can all make use of in making this work better.
And I think I just wanted to add to this, because I think it's quite important and useful, as COPE, you know, is now open up to institutions as members, and UCL has joined COPE as a member as well. And I think we are actually particularly excited about working with COPE and actually hopefully helping to solve some of those discussions and kind of contribute towards resolving those issues one way or another. So I'm very much looking forward to having kind of more of those discussions and trying to bridge that gap that we have around peer review.
Yeah, maybe just my two thoughts, just to add on to what has already been shared by the panel, is that perhaps we should focus a little bit more on the peer review happening before the end stage of writing up your study, when the analysis has been done, when the study has been the study protocol, the study methods have already been formed. And I know that this is something that is going on already. We have quite a lot of, I've heard it in a number of different panels. I know that there is already some evidence to show that registered reports work. It's also, again, not a perfect system, but peer review, I think, happening earlier, instead of us only focusing on what do we do with the research that ends up on the editor's desk. So trying to actually ask the questions in a preventative way of approaching this, by saying, let's actually to instill from institutions, but also from funders, of promoting the kind of practice of asking for the research to be going through a review at each stage at which it's being done. And I know that PCI registered reports, does a lot on using the community of peer reviewers to actually give a sort of like a stamp on the research that's being done, that then different journals have different ways of accepting this or not. Although I think so it's more of a trend, and I think that we need to actually ask the question of peer review starting a little bit earlier in the research cycle. That would be my 2 cents on this.
Great. Thank you, Gowri. So we had a question just about the common indicators of fabricated or falsified data in RCTs. And so I think John, could go ahead with that, but then I think just widen it to what are the kind of common red flags that you see kind of in for editors and peer reviewers that make you it's what my team at BMC used to call my spidey sense. So it's what sets your spidey sense off during peer review. John, go ahead.
Well, I've made some comments already, in addition to which, so the comment about trial registration beforehand, it can be useful, although we've had a few papers we've identified as having substantial falsified data where they were pre-registered and the reporting methodology matched what they said. But on clinicaltrials.gov, I'll go to the website, I'll compare the first and the last version, I'll look at historical changes, I'll look at the rapidity of recruitment, I'll look at the number of dropouts, I'll look at the similarities between that paper and other papers the authors have published. We obviously have plagiarism software, as many other journals do. And the unpolitical comments I made earlier about where papers come from, I'm afraid it is true that we have identified more falsified data from certain places than others. So I will carry on using that until those countries and those institutions have rigorous processes. So a comment earlier about where does this process start? I think it's only reliably going to start in universities and other research institutions. If their systems are not quite watertight, but much better than they are at the moment, I think we'll be in receipt of fewer papers and more of which hopefully will be of high quality. So those are my red flags. And perhaps the simplest ones are numbers in tables and figures.
Can I share a paper that came out quite recently, and I think it might be useful to everyone, and it's by Lisa Parker and others, and it's sort of how to screen for fake papers. They went quite interesting analysis of different things, so that might be useful to have a look at, especially by editors, I think. But from my editorial sort of days and working as editors, I think maybe to add to what John said, for me, I always looked at ethics. Obviously, if you're dealing with a research that has human participants, but that's often an overlooked thing, or sort of like if there is a fake research, they usually write it in a way that sounds just a bit dodgy. I don't know how to explain it a bit better, or odd, or you read it and you're a bit like, what do they mean by that? So that's one, I think. Or if you have any concerns about ethics generally, and this actually applies to animal research as well, because in my experience, when I had concerns about studies and they turn out not to be, let's say, done maybe fully well, I had ethical concerns, for example, about how the animals were treated, what was done to them. So kind of ethics, I think, is a good angle as well for those type of studies.
I think what Magda and John you're talking about is incredibly important, but it's also so resource intensive, and it requires such attention to detail and expertise, and that is very hard to scale. I've posted in the chat a preprint actually by a colleague at Sage, who has been using technology to try and identify sort of replicated or language in peer reviews. And I think technology has to be part of the answer here. So there are not only obviously plagiarism detection technologies, but also the different types of technology that identify sort of image manipulation as well, which is an increasing issue. But that has to go hand in hand with human judgment and assessment and analysis. And so it's incredibly, whatever way you look at it, it's labor intensive and it requires time and resource and expertise. And I think we all have to do our best with that, but it's never going to be a perfect system.
So I'm going to jump on to that point from Caroline. So in this plays to the questions that was raised in the Q&A. So it's once you've got hold of the raw data, never mind the issues with potentially privacy with clinical data, then yeah, what do we do with this data? Can we really manually do this? And so that plays into the question that Caroline was raising is, do we need technology? Do we need tools that can supplement or add on to human judgment? So that's the question that was posed by Tracy Weisgerber and colleagues in a recent paper in BMC Research Notes, is the future of peer review automated?
If I jump on this one, and again, I think more and more will be automated, and I think that's a good thing, but at the end of the day, nothing I think will, for now, will change the human aspects of looking at things, because what we've learned, for example, of plagiarism, anyone can now run plagiarism check very quickly and easily, and actually most journals run it automatically. And actually as well, this happens at universities where also theses are run through similar processes, plagiarism check. But once you get the report, it doesn't tell you if there's plagiarism or not, right? There's still the human need to actually look at the report to understand whether there are actually concerns or not. Because the system, again, the technology will get better, but I think the human element of looking at reasonableness, and I know this is terribly unscientific to think about things that are reasonable, but unfortunately, there's the balance of probabilities that things look iffy or not. And I feel that there is that element needed of human there. And I'm going to post something that might not be very popular, but I do actually believe that peer review would be better for it if we had professionalized checking of publication ethics by sort of professional reviewers of publication ethics. And I think then the scientific peer review could focus on what it is there to do, to think about the science of it, because that's the expertise only those scientists will have. But when it comes to publication ethics, that's something that can be trained, can be taught, can be specialized, and those people can learn how to use technology most effectively, also what its limitations are.
Can I step in? So yes, I think computerized algorithms to look at both summary data in papers and to look at individual patient data and to look at Western blots and to look at other plots is definitely the future. But obviously the same technology can be used by people who wish to make up data and so on, and that's bound to happen. I can write a computerized program now that will make sure that if I submitted anything to myself, I would escape my own detection. So it's not that difficult to do, to make up vast spreadsheets of individual patient data that fulfill most statistical criteria that you might expect. So I come back to my point that really the only way is going to be to try and improve the reliability and truth of science at source, so where it's done rather than once it gets to the journals.
Yeah, we need to improve the training and resources at the base level, absolutely. And this idea of an arms race has already been seen with plagiarism. So people have realized that it's generally looking for blocks of text, although there are some that look as for kind of bags of words approach as well. And so people have started to use synonyms, which creates gibberish if they're not careful. And so now people are looking for those common gibberish synonyms as well. So it's a constant struggle as you put a tool in place and then people learn how to circumvent it, but maybe then give themselves away in the process. So it's definitely there are going to be lots of unforeseen consequences with the use of tools. So that mention of unforeseen consequences, I think, goes to so Gavin Ravy's had a comment that's been sitting there right from the start. So how do we make sure when we're thinking about, so we're being super cautious now and we're being super skeptical about everything and we're not trusting anyone. We're just going for the kind of tinkering approach of science. How do we make sure we don't unduly go against the revolutions that cause breakthroughs in science?
I think this speaks somewhat to bias in general in peer review, and to the extent of confirmation bias in the example that you're talking about. There's another question in the Q&A around sort of more established or well-known scholars getting through peer review much more easily, and the important part that double anonymized peer review plays. And I think ultimately it's going to go back to the training of the reviewers, which obviously we've talked about being as part of the solution without necessarily presenting the solution in terms of how this is funded and delivered. I also do think we need to talk about the system of incentivization in scholarly publishing and career progression, and the fact that scholars are under such pressure to publish that is creating exponential increase in output, in submissions to journals, which in turn places greater pressure on the peer review ecosystem at large. And so I think some of this needs to be tackled even more at source than sort of research integrity offices, but to at the source of sort of why academics are putting their work out and the pressure that they are under that makes them behave either too hastily or unscrupulously in some cases to get their work out. So I think it's not just about the role of peer review in and of itself, it's also about the much wider system of incentives.
Yeah, and so Caroline's point there about the more established researchers. So there was a recent study which looked at a paper from and his more junior colleague, and it found that if you gave no name versus the Nobel Prize winner name versus the junior colleague, then the Nobel Prize winner got the easier ride in peer review, next most the anonymized, and then next most the junior colleague being named. So there was a confounder that it might not just be the junior, but she was also with a name that you can tell is a kind of non-Western name as well. But so does this suggest that double-blind review might be the best for the integrity of research, even though many journals are now pushing towards transparency and open review as well?
I think interesting that sort of double-blind peer review has been for a long time with us, right? Publishing, it's been tested and trialed and so on around and inevitably it runs into the issue that what's truly anonymous. And this is generally what's anonymous in science is, I think, a generally bigger question considering data protection laws. But I think the problem is, and that's many people rightly or wrongly think they know who the authors are, because especially in small research fields, and again, this will depend on the fields. If you're talking about general molecular biology, but if you're talking about specific aspect of the molecular biology, maybe the fields are actually not as massive as you think. So people have tendencies to write certain way. And as a researcher, as I used to be a researcher, there are some papers I knew who wrote them, or which groups wrote them, because there is a style to what they do. There's topic they develop. So I don't think it's necessarily wins everything and always, but it certainly is a good idea. And I think that's why we need to have options. And personally, I've always liked open and transparent review. I think transparent seems the fairest to everyone involved, but as long as it's known what the peer review comments say, I think that's already always a win.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, with open science and the push to share preprints and also pre-register your study protocols, I think it will increasingly be quite difficult to have a double-blind peer review. Just looking at where the scientific community is moving, not only in terms of responsible conduct of research, but also how we are going to be rewarding open science practices. So I do think that the open peer review model would be personally my favorite choice, given also the trend towards increased transparency, ideally leading to then accountability and hopefully also trustworthiness in knowing who's said what and why they may have said that. So that would be my concern. How do we, maintain double-blind peer review, given, the whole move towards open science?
I'm more than happy as a reviewer to give my name every time I review. If I don't know who's submitted the paper, so that side of the blinding, it to some extent ties my arms about learning, about using what I've learned already. So knowing who's publishing a paper, even if I'm not suspecting falsified data, allows me to sort of build a story of their research projects, this being the most recent edition. Sometimes people will salami slice research projects, etc., and knowing who's submitted papers can assist in that.
Okay, last thoughts before we wrap up, otherwise I'm going to...
I think on the double blinding of the review, just to say that it's probably also interesting to ask the question, why do we need double blinding of peer review? So what is this bigger problem there, as you have just, the research that you just quoted, Matt, about having preferential, certain people getting preferential treatment. I think that is actually really the problem that we need to talk about and address, because the double blinding of the peer review is sort of, putting a plaster on the problem. And yes. I think that
why do we have biases in the first place? Yeah, digging much deeper. Okay, great. So we can end off with a really rapid question, which will merge what I was going to ask with what was asked in the Q&A. So what's the one change you want to make to peer review to help improve research integrity, and what message do you want to get across to people about like training and education?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, sorry, go Caroline, I'm not doing my job.
For me, I mean, there's so much training and resources and guidance available. It's to encourage people to use that a lot of it is free. But specifically, and this is kind of with my perspective as somebody who is very focused on diversity, equity, inclusion and accessibility for both SAGE and COPE, I think better awareness and training amongst reviewers, journal editors about those issues, and publishers too, will kind of drastically support peer review and also increase representation across the scholarly ecosystem.
Great. Magdalena?
So in terms of change, as I mentioned before, I would like to see professionalization of publication ethics review. But in terms of maybe last message is what I think we can all lead in research integrity, no matter where we are within our research life cycle, whether are reviewers or responding to reviewers, and how we behave and will affect others around us. So if we give them the good example, that will help them to be better themselves. I think but that's where research integrity principle can help, hopefully, even if you don't have formal training.
That's great. John?
I'll stick to type and I'll just say mandatory raw data.
Excellent. Short and sweet. And Gowri?
Yeah, I think mine will be, well, I have very many, so I'll just pick two. I'll just stick to training of good and responsible peer review. So how can I be a good and responsible peer reviewer? I think that we should train researchers from the get-go.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much, all of you. I really enjoyed that. I hope our audience did as well. Thank you for the questions. Apologies to the two people we didn't quite get to, but I hope we addressed it and we can continue the discussion on Twitter. Thank you to Mary and Ease for hosting it. Thank you to James for the intro. And yeah, thank you everyone for watching, and enjoy the rest of peer review week.
Thank you.
Have
Bye.
a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.